Hello, my name is Dan Konjorski, and welcome to Bible-ethics.com. I am your host for this morning. My wife couldn't make it. We have two wonderful grandkids visiting us for a while. And I want to ask you to please follow and subscribe to our podcast. I would appreciate that as we grow from here. Today, I want to talk about Genesis 29 in a very short version. We're changing the length of time we're going to be spending on our podcast at Bible-ethics.com. I want to talk about Genesis 29, where Jacob arrives in Padan Aram. He went there sent by Isaac, his father, to find a wife from among his mother's family. Because Isaac didn't want Jacob to marry outside of Isaac didn't want Jacob to marry any Canaanite women. That's why Isaac sent Jacob up there to Padan Aram. So I'll be reading verses 1 through approximately 7. Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the open country with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We are from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said. "And here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." Verse 7, "Look," he said, "the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture." And then they replied in verse 8, "We can't," they replied, "until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." So I'm going to go with verse 9 because I think this is significant. While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. I think what happened is what normally happens when men see a beautiful woman is they begin to take things into their own hands and do something to impress that young lady. For instance, Jacob really liked what he saw in Rachel, so he went and took matters in his own hands. And what we find here is that Jacob falls in love with Rachel. And later on, we'll see in the story, in the chapter, that he goes to Laban and says, "I would like to marry Rachel." And Laban says, "Okay, work 7 years for me, and you can have Rachel as your wife." So Jacob goes to work for Laban for 7 years, and then he calls for his wife from Laban. Says he basically tells Laban, "So I worked for you for 7 years. Now I want Rachel as my wife." So what Laban does is Laban deceives Jacob, and on the wedding night, to everyone's surprise, even much to our surprise as a reader, is that Jacob on his wedding night goes to bed with his wife. And it's in the morning that he finds out it wasn't Rachel, but Leah, Rachel's older sister. And I found there is some irony in there and some humor in there. And as I read that, they must not have good lighting back then, because how can you tell exactly who? He didn't know that it was Leah that night. It's kind of strange, and kind of a bunch of irony there. And there's some irony too in that also we know Jacob earlier in life, he deceived Esau for the birthright, and for the blessing of his father as well. And so we see a lot of irony in this story. And so he finds out that Laban deceives him, and he goes to Laban and says, "You tricked me, you deceived me." And Laban says, "Well, it's within our culture not to give the youngest daughter first to marriage." So basically, Laban says, "If you want Rachel as a wife, you must work for me for another 7 years." So look what Jacob does. He works for another 7 years for the marriage of Rachel. And what we'll later find out is Leah wasn't very favored with Jacob, yet God blessed Leah. And Jacob's sons mostly come from, or children mostly come from Leah. And then Jacob and Rachel had two sons, Benjamin and then Joseph, which we'll talk about at another time. But I find that there are some things here that we can take away from this story. One is that God's guidance, or we must believe that God guides us in our journey. That's one way of saying it. Jacob's journey to Haran, it really testified to God's guidance and protection. God leads us through difficult times. And what we see here in this journey is a couple things. Remember last podcast we talked about how Jacob had a dream of the ladder to heaven, or this. I like to think of it as Stairway to Heaven, but I'm thinking of the 1970s song. But anyway, um, so we see that there's some spiritual growth in Jacob, and that God is really guiding Jacob in this. And God is having difficult times once he gets to Laban, okay? But God's guidance, really, and his protection is with Jacob. Also, notice that what we see in Jacob is patience and sacrifice. He really loved Rachel. He wanted Rachel as his wife. So Jacob was really patient with Laban. And we find too that he sacrificed 14 years. 14 years. No matter if it's the same amount of 365 days that we enjoy for a year or not, 14 years seems like a long time, whatever that looked like back then. Um, so Jacob works for 7, gets Leah as his first wife, and he works another 7 and gets Rachel, his favored one, um, for his wife. So there's a lot of patience that Jacob has, and selflessness in his pursuit to marry Rachel, the one he loves. So what we can pick up from there is it takes a lot of patience and sacrifice to pursue our goals. No matter what our goals are in life, whether it's the startup of a business or whatever it is, it takes a lot of patience and sacrifice in trusting that God is guiding us and leading us through this whole time. No matter what kind of work that we do, uh, as long as it's moral and it's not hurting anyone, it's not hurting ourselves, we must be patient. And there's going to be some time that's sacrificed, and our trust is in God, that God is guiding and leading us. Also, notice another point that we can learn from here is this idea of deception versus trust. Laban's deceit and sending Leah instead of Rachel teaches us the value of trusting God's plan and being patient when we have challenges. And so people in our lifetime will deceive us. People in our lifetime, it doesn't matter if they're family or not. And Laban is an extended family to Jacob here, and there is some deception there. There's some deceiving going on. But we yet need to trust God in all areas of our life. We need to believe that God has his hand of protection upon us, right? I want you to notice something about Jacob in this story is that there is some spiritual growth that has happened in Jacob's life. Jacob who becomes Israel, renamed Israel. Um, and that's very important to recognize because Jacob has the promises of God, right? Just like Isaac did, just like Abraham did. Jacob has the promises of God. And he obviously experienced some spiritual growth. He recognized God in the dream that he had experienced. He recognized that God's message to him was that he will be with him and protect him and provide for him. And what we can pick up from that is we really need to live God's will in our life. So, in short, today, I want you to walk away from this Bible-ethics.com podcast realizing that faith in God, trusting God's guidance in our life, trusting God's will in our life, and patience. We need that patience to believe that God's plan is being worked out in our lives. Why? So we can glorify Him in all that we do. So my trust today is in God's will for my life. Is your trust in God's will for your life today? As you read this story, I hope you can learn that same thing, that throughout our journey, trust in God's will, trust in God's guidance, and believe that He has a blessing for you. So again, I hope that you follow us on Bible-ethics.com by subscribing to our podcast. Thank you.